This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. The question of the day is this: is medical and health freedom a popular cause? Does that popularity include the right to decline medical treatments such as vaccines? And if you do decline them for your children, for example, should public schools take them in? And what is public opinion about this matter? Now, the conventional wisdom, as far as I can tell, as of a week ago, was that these causes were unpopular, that these were political losers, that the American people love, the CDC vaccine schedule, and that all the polls were showing that all the things that RFK is doing and the MAHA movement generally, those causes are not winners, that voters are wildly split on these questions. But when you examine the questions, speaking in particular of there were two polls that came out, one in December, I think one in January, by a polling firm named Fabrizio, and they both generated results that the polling firm itself summarized as vaccine skepticism is a political loser. Don't go there. And that message resonated all over Washington. Well, Leslie Manookian of the Health Freedom Defense Fund and I were talking about this, and we thought, it's not quite right, because you look at these poll questions, they were asking things like, do vaccines save lives? Yes or no? Well, what kind of question is that? Vaccines have been around for 230 years. Are we supposed to believe that somebody would say that they never saved a life, not even the rabies shot? I mean, this is a preposterous question. I'm surprised that it didn't result in 100% saying vaccines save lives. In fact, there's a lot of people who said they don't. A surprising number of people, actually. But you can see the bias of this question. Another one said, should we disturb established protocols in dealing with whooping cough and hepatitis B? These sound like terrible diseases. So no, we don't want to disturb the existing protocols. All the questions in this poll were very suspicious. I wrote an article about it because it seemed like they were all designed to trigger exactly the responses that they had. So Leslie and I got together, and she suggested we work with a polling firm named Zogby Strategies, very credible polling firm, and actually put together a fully, wholly objective, unbiased questionnaire. We asked 30 questions concerning, health freedom, indemnification of the industry, the status of vaccine mandates, what people's views really are on this topic. And the explosive results came to us over the weekend, and we just put it out today. And so I've invited Leslie to be with me on this show to discuss the results. Leslie Manookian, glad to have you.
So great to be here with you today, Jeffrey. It's so exciting, too, to have these results, because they really contradict this narrative that's being pushed by not only the media, but also by, it seems, the administration in many ways. And I can just say for myself, this whole exercise has been one heck of an education about what the true purpose of these polls really is. And I think that's something we should talk about.
So the result was basically a supermajorities and all kinds of questions related to medical freedom. And the pollster himself told us that it's very rare to see results that are this intense. And he also was involved in vetting the questions to make sure that they were objective and unbiased, and was rather startled by them.
Yeah, I think this is the most important point, is that we see all these polls that are reported by the media. Very rarely do we actually dig deep and actually analyze the questions, how they're being posed, and therefore what results they are achieving. And what we found was that it was totally manipulated. Like, do you believe in the past, right? These are other polls. Do you believe that life-saving vaccinations or necessary like vaccinations like MMR and these others should be mandated, or that they're life-saving, right? It's such loaded questions. And so what Jeffrey and I endeavored to do is to create truly objective questions that are going to reveal how Americans honestly think about these issues. And we went through this, multi-day iterative process with Zogby in order to ensure that our poll questions were in fact objective, right? That they were neutral, that they weren't intended to result in a certain outcome. And boy, what did we find out, Jeffrey? That we're not crazy, that people actually are reasonable when they are asked reasonable questions, and that most of them cherish their right to make their own decisions. They believe that corporations should be held accountable for their products, and that we should be free to make our own decisions, and that there should be transparency around this stuff. It's what actually shocked me was that even a few % of people don't think that people should have the right to make their own medical choices. Like, what are these people thinking? I wonder what goes through their minds. Are they just authoritarians at heart?
I have to tell you, Leslie, from my point of view, this has been a real education, because I think polls have been, I've been skeptical of polls for a very long time, mainly for one reason, which is called the social desirability bias, right? So if you call people up and say, what do you think about Donald Trump, who some people say is an autocrat? They're going to say, oh, yeah, I don't like him, right? I mean, so even if they feel a different way, they're going to tell the pollster one way because they think they know what the right answers are. So I've understood that bias for a very long time. But the thing that made this one different for me is that I was so skeptical of this, the Fabrizio poll, that I began to dig through the questions. And they weren't, by the way, easy to find. The only thing, the top line results were easy to find. But digging through the questions, you have to do a kind of a common sense test. Like, okay, I'm imagining myself in front of a pollster asking me a question like, do vaccines save lives? Which way am I being nudged to answer? And whatever you feel is probably the result that the pollster intended. We shouldn't forget these pollsters work for major corporate clients. I think Fabrizio itself on its website says it works for Fortune 500 companies, among whom Pfizer, right? So we have here a poll that was designed to come up with the right answers. And I was quite frankly shocked, because on one hand, I understand the social desirability bias, but I guess I thought that pollsters had a kind of integrity about them, that they certainly, were curious about what people actually thought. So, this kind of changed my attitude towards polls. Did you learn anything from this process too?
Without a doubt. So, originally, well, let me just say, when it came to polls about vaccinations, I've been working on the whole vaccine freedom and vaccine safety awareness movement for, nearly 25 years now, or about 25 years. And so I've seen how they, contrive these polls in order to, get the desired result. I've seen that with respect to vaccinations, but I didn't really understand how these polls were being used to do two things. This was not really apparent to me in the past. I thought, okay, they're trying to fake public opinion about vaccines, but it's different. What they're really trying to do with those Fabrizio polls, is to manipulate the public into believing that unless they think this way, they're in the fringe, right? So that's one objective. And I think the other objective of these polls is to make policymakers believe that these issues are unpopular with the electorate, and therefore they shouldn't pay attention to them. And so this is very clear. Like, there are very powerful interests that are behind these polls, that are pushing these polls in order to manipulate the public into complacency and, obedience. And then I think the other part of it, which is really big, and this is just what I've learned in doing this, is that if they're trying to signal to members of Congress, to policymakers in the administration and elsewhere that, hey, you don't want to go here. It's unpopular with the electorate. This is not the kind of stuff you want to do. And so what I've realized is this is very, it really has its roots in Bernays, Edward Bernays, who was the, first true propagandist who studied, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he deployed Freud's, his research against the public in order to manipulate the public into doing what the leadership wanted it to do. And so I think that's what's really happening. They are using Bernaysian protocols and philosophies in order to manipulate the people and the policies to do what those behind the scenes really want.
Yeah, I'll never look
that
at
I didn't realize. I just didn't realize it.
I didn't realize that either, and I'll never look at polls the same way. At the very least, I'm going to be interested to look at the kinds of questions they're asking, among what groups and why. So just to be clear, what we have going on here is we have a major polling firm that does work for a lot of corporate clients. And now the client is going to have some say in how the poll is constructed and how the results come out. And the polling firm, of course, is going to be inclined to want to do the bidding of the people that are paying the bills. Those same clients are also paying the politicians, right? So, big campaign donations in exchange for which they get favorable regulatory treatment, or they get influence in Washington, which is the only reason why a corporate client would be giving money to a big political campaign. It's not because they love democracy. They're doing it to wield influence. So you've got these two interests now working. So the politician that wants to protect his relationship with the corporate client is going to go back to the polling firm that he knows is in the pay of the same corporate clients and say, give us a poll to show that your corporate interests are really popular with the public, to protect me against claims or against populist agitation. Then I'm a corporate shill, right? It's something like that.
Yeah, I think it's maybe even worse in that we spent so much time and energy in trying to sterilize our questions, right? Ensure that they were neutral. They are doing the opposite of that, right? It's not like they just asked the pollsters to go and run with it and create a poll. They are intimately involved. They are crafting these questions in order to yield the exact response they want. And then they know that the captured media is going to say exactly what they want. So we're trying to get our poll out there in the media, and so far they don't seem very interested. Very interestingly, right?
This is also funny. It's like if McDonald's goes to Fabrizio and says, we want to know if our new Arch Deluxe, is going to be popular. And here's the question: would you like a well-priced value meal with a delicious hamburger and fries and a drink? And what do people think? I mean, they're going to get the answer that they want. Now, they don't usually make it that obvious. But in the case of the Fabrizio poll on vaccines, they just put little words in there, that just tilt things enough to skew the results.
Yeah, they say necessary vaccines when they're when they're pretending to ask a question about whether or not people support vaccine mandates, right? Necessary. Oh my gosh, it's life. It's needed in order to survive, right? Like our survival depends on this, and that's how they portray it. And then, of course, people are going to say something.
Yeah, or another one is established protocols, right? It's like, yeah, who's against established protocols? I'm like, what does that even mean? It sounds like they work well. Why else would they be established, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did deliberately in the poll was to ask a question two different directions, or two different ways. One was to ask whether or not vaccines should be studied more thoroughly than they have been and whether the public supports doing so. But then I did something a little bit more interesting, which was to take the word vaccines out and simply say, should we do more research into the potential safety concerns regarding polysorbate 80, mercury, aluminum, polyethylene glycol, and other ingredients in common medications? And you know what happened, right? these are all ingredients in vaccines, but the public doesn't know it. When you take out the word vaccinations or vaccines, I think it was 88%, somewhere in the 80s, people supported doing more research. When you insert the word vaccine, it's lower. It's still very close to a super majority. But the point is, that word is so reactive, right? It's kryptonite for so many people that they can't think clearly. And so when you just completely sanitize it and you say, we're just going to ask specifically about these ingredients and whether or not it should be studied for safety, then everybody agrees with it. I think it's very, very interesting. And it just illustrates to me how very easy it is to manipulate people into, yielding a desired outcome. It's very, very fascinating.
Well, if you have the results in front of you, why don't you march through the what you consider to be the most impressive results of the poll?
Oh, goodness. Okay, now I have to open it and hope my thing doesn't crash again.
That's fine. No, that's fine.
There were so many things that I thought were really, truly extraordinary. Can you see me all?
Well, the right to refuse medical treatments is just like 86 or 90%.
87.9%. So that's just staggering. That is so, no one can argue against the possibility or this idea. There are people who say that, we should force medications, we should force masks, we should force tests, we should force vaccinations. And yet, when you ask someone and you ask the public, should you have the right to refuse medical treatment generally, 88% agree with that. This isn't a fringe. They want you to think that we're fringe for thinking this. 59% strongly agreed with that. And then if you look at the right to make one's own medical choices as a basic human right, that it should be protected by law, 87%, which actually really supports the Idaho Medical Freedom Act, which we were able to pass in Idaho last year, right? So
yeah, and just to be clear, not to say the obvious, but it was just a few years ago that millions upon millions, countless millions of people, tens of millions, maybe more than 100 million, were forced to get an experimental shot in the name of getting us out of the COVID-19 problem. And people who refused were kicked out of school, kicked out of the military, kicked out of the jobs, refused access to public schools. I mean, there was a time I couldn't even, I was walking the streets of Manhattan and not even allowed to go into, sit down in a bar and have a beer. I mean, my papers were checked at the door.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. And so, there was this messaging, right? You're a grandma killer, it's a small ask, wear a mask. It's all these things designed to make you feel that if you exercise your rights and freedom, or if you diverge from the popular opinion, then you're some kind of a fringe wacko. When the truth is that people who were educated were asking serious questions that were just being ignored by those in, with the grasp of the reins of power. And so this poll proves that all of that you weren't in any way crazy, Jeffrey, and that you should have been able to do everything you wanted, and that most Americans agree now. I mean, it's let's think also of all of our colleagues who were in the medical field, who were marginalized, right? Who were literally silenced, had their licenses removed or threatened, were pulled before their medical boards and things like this. And in the poll, 88% of people believe that doctors should be free to speak with patients openly about the dangers of vaccinations, not just medical and, advice in general, but vaccinations without fear of medical board backlash. And it just speaks to your experience and that of everybody else. They're walking down the street. They can't go where they want. I couldn't go anywhere. I literally couldn't go to any restaurants in my town. Couldn't go to the entertainment venues. I couldn't go anywhere because I couldn't go to the gym without a vaccine passport. I couldn't do anything.
And they didn't exclude you from churches as such, as far as I know, but a lot of the churches actually implemented vaccine passports themselves. So you couldn't go to worship God with others if you weren't vaccinated. Yet this poll reveals overwhelming support for the right to associate, even if you refuse medical treatment. It's very plain. Some
of the other stuff that I found so compelling was how much support there was. Well, first of all, was that the health insurance, we asked, should health insurance cover holistic treatments? And 76% of the public said this, because what's happening right now is
they don't right now. They don't, right?
No, they don't. I mean, very rarely. My policy supposedly covers chiropractic, but I mean, it's like 3 chiropractic adjustments in a year or some ridiculous thing. So if you injure yourself and want to go twice a week or, for a couple of months or something, they won't cover it. And it's only a small, copay that they cover. So this is crazy. And the reality is that upwards of 40% of Americans are accessing holistic health every single year. They just have to pay for it out of pocket. And what this really evidences is this stranglehold that the medical machine has on our lives, right? We spend more on medicine than any other country in the world in aggregate, but we also spend more per capita than any other country in the world. Yet we have the worst outcomes of any country in the developed world. And
we should add to that the very important point that even, recently Congress made it possible for health insurance to offer catastrophic plans. But those catastrophic plans must, as a matter of law, include what they call preventative care, which, you guessed it, means vaccination. So it's a matter of law that health insurance in this country must cover vaccinations, but they don't cover holistic things, chiropractic, treatments, homeopathy, or anything else. So that's where we are. And this poll shows that this is a wildly unpopular view. So it would be greatly to the advantage of any political movement to rally around this poll and adjust the current system in a way that keeps with public opinion. What are some other aspects of the poll that stood out to you?
Well, one of the things was the parents' right to refuse vaccines for their children and dependents. It was 66% agreed with that. And it wasn't as strong of a super majority as we saw in some of the other questions, but that's not the right way to look at this. If you look back to 2016, 80% of people believed that vaccines are safe and that parents shouldn't have the right to basically opt them out. It was somewhere in the 7 to 80, 85% range. So this is a massive erosion in the public's commitment or acceptance of being forced to do things for their children that they don't want to do. So this is huge. I mean, this suggests that people don't trust the health authorities and what they've been telling them, and that COVID was the biggest unforced error in the history of vaccines and in medicine. And so, it's not as, like I say, as strong as we've seen in some of the other categories, but it is unbelievable that most people now believe that parents should be able to opt their children out or make their own decisions about vaccinations for their children. That's not the way it was a few years ago. And so that's huge. And then if you look down to some of the areas where, just how popular are these issues are with the voters, there were so many aspects of it that were so compelling. We're looking at usually 60, 70, 80% of the public will vote for a candidate who stands for freedom, who stands for transparency, who wants to hold the corporations accountable. So 70% opposed a liability shield for the pesticide manufacturers. Upwards, I think it was over 80% opposed the pharmaceutical industry not having the same liability for their products that all other.
That was closer to 60%, wasn't it? You might check that. I should be. Yeah,
Jeff, when it was
80% in general,
vaccines, it was 59%. But when it was asked about pharmaceuticals in general, it was over 80.
Yeah, there you
go.
Right. So just to be clear. Yeah, vaccines are the only product that I can think of that is currently completely indemnified against all being responsible for any harms that they impose, even proven harms. The industry does not have to pay. In extremely rare cases, the government will pay, but that program has been largely useless. But the industry itself is incentivized to keep dishing out these products one after one after one without taking any responsibility for the consequences of it, which is completely contrary to all Western law and capitalist ethos and everything. It's just crazy. It all happened in 1986. This poll reveals that 60% of people want that liability shield taken away from vaccines in particular, which would mean repealing the PrEP Act and reversing the 1986 Vaccine Injury Act, right?
Or at the very least, removing the liability shield from it. So this is the thing, you know, Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona introduced a bill to repeal the liability shield that's in the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And then why is it, I can't remember, I think it was Rand Paul who just introduced the companion bill in the Senate, right? And so 60% of voters support this. I mean, every single congressperson should be supporting this because it's popular and there's no reason not to. I mean, it's insane that this is a product that is mandated by state governments, recommended by the federal government, oftentimes researched by the federal government, which the CDC recommends and also is charged with monitoring the safety, which is an inherent conflict of interest. And then the federal government indemnifies the manufacturers while the states are mandating them on their children. This is just lunacy, right? And thankfully, Representative Gosar and Senator Rand Paul want to rectify this by removing the liability shield. And there's popular support for it. So this should be happening. These are the kinds of things, the pesticide immunity shield that they're trying to push into the Farm Bill, it shouldn't happen because 70% of respondents said that they don't support this. And so I think that
you follow this a lot more carefully than I do and have for so many years. I was a little late to the game here. Have you ever seen a poll like this, that are even remotely like this?
Never. I mean, first of all, I've never seen someone honestly ask 1,000 very likely voters what they thought about these without, crafting these loaded questions. Never. I've never seen someone actually ask, how do you feel about basic freedoms? How do you feel? Informed consent, that was the most interesting one. 91% of people said that they believe in the medical principle of informed consent. And let's remember, Jeffrey, that this requires information and voluntary consent. And if you don't know what the true risk profile is, right, the true safety and efficacy of a product, how can you be informed? You can't be. And if you don't know what the impact of the entire vaccination schedule is, for instance, how can you possibly make an informed choice? You can't. And then on top of it, in a lot of states, California, Washington, Oregon, these states are pushing to mandate the CDC recommended schedule or to make it more aggressive than the new CDC schedule. And the same thing's happening in the Northeast. So this is just, this is not supported by the public. The public wants 91%. I've never seen anything like this, Jeffrey. 91% believe in the medical ethic of informed consent. And they should. They should.
Yeah, that's remarkable. And as you say, we've got big movements in many states to close off even religious exemptions for children to attend school, which is causing all sorts of upheavals. I mean, families are leaving, right? I'm just in anticipation of this. They're leaving some of these northeastern states and these coastal states, that are imposing these kind of things. Now,
let's be clear. California, I just have to say this, California, New York, Connecticut, Maine, and West Virginia is kind of in the middle, mandate vaccinations and only offer what are called medical exemptions. But it's almost impossible to get a medical exemption. In fact, you can't obtain one until after your child has been catastrophically injured by one vaccination. And then they'll only give you a medical exemption for that one shot. Yeah. So they are literally forcing parents to risk their children's lives in order to receive a public school, public education. It's inhumane. It's so heartbreaking that they're doing this. I mean, it's evil. Let's be honest. It's really, truly evil because a parent's number one duty is to take care of their children. And the schools are making it almost impossible, and these states to do so.
Let's talk about the partisan split here. It's not as wide as I might have suspected. I think it's tilted red in the sense that, Republican voters tend to be a little more for medical and health freedom in general, but it's not, the gap is not as big as one might suppose. Is that right?
Not at all. I think it's so interesting, and I think it's actually one of the questions that we asked I was a little bit disappointed that the way that it was actually posed to the those being polled. We asked whether or not their view of, say, public health agencies had changed since COVID. But what does that mean? Does it mean since February or March of 2020? Does it mean since 2023?
That was a little ambiguous. I guess we only spotted that after the fact, right?
Well, no, I actually changed it and wanted it to say 2019 in there, but it just didn't. I don't know. I guess somebody thought that it was better phrased the other way. But the problem is that it kind of obscured the real shift, because if you ask me, a lot of conservatives sort of woke up during COVID. I think if you look back to 2019, exactly, in 2019, Republicans had more faith in government, in the CDC, than Democrats did. And now that's reversed a bit, but it's not nearly as stark as, some of the pundits and the media outlets would have you believe, right? They want the New York Times wants the average New York Times reader to believe that you're a fringe lunatic if you support informed consent. That's what they want you to believe. And it's not the case. The vast majority of conservatives and a very clear majority of Democrats agree with the medical ethic of informed consent, and they believe that it's a parent's right to make medical choices. And they believe that American adults should be able to make their own medical choices. It's not controversial, and it shouldn't be controversial.
So to be clear, it was 1,000 people were polled. It was equal numbers of independents and Republicans and Democrats, and the data is broken down by gender and whether you have children and how much education you have and these kinds of things. So, once you get to looking at the at the data, you can drill down into this all day long and sort of find fascinating things. And the Brownstone release of this added as much data as we possibly could in there. So you can just download it all and just examine it. But one of the things I found fascinating was a kind of a class difference in educational achievement, right? So what you have here is people without college degrees generally are I would say better on these subjects than those with college educations, which is a fascinating lens, especially in light of the COVID period, where the Zoom classes, were happy to lock themselves in their houses and apartments and let the working classes deliver food, and so we saw a little bit of that in some of the educational splits. Did you notice that too?
I did. And the other thing I noticed, that's not something that surprises me very much, because I'll just say that in the last 25 years of doing this work, the people that I would speak to who were less educated were the ones, who were the most open to the possibility that maybe they weren't being told the truth about certain.
I should say fewer college credentials, right?
Yes, I should, because they're not less educated.
They're more educated.
Yes. What's interesting, and they also have their wits about them in a way that's so much, so very important. And the way that I look at it is that those of us who have gone to these institutions have been very literally institutionalized into believing that the laptop class is, above reproach and would never lie to us, right? Uncle so-and-so would never be dishonest. Aunt, whatever, Sister Jane, she knows all of these issues. And these people are people that we know and respect and trust, supposedly. And so, and I think there's this psychological component. We want to believe that people who are in our sort of circle are honest, decent people, right? And the system that benefited us is genuine, right? That it can be trusted. And the truth is, this is something that I learned 25 years ago when I quit working on Wall Street, right? I walked away from it all because I felt that it was morally bankrupt. It was destroying my soul. And the people who were, just my friends who didn't work in those areas, they were like, good for you. That's fantastic. I'm so glad. The colleagues who were going to keep their nose to the grindstone in those areas were outright angry at us. And I think that this just evidences this sort of, when you go into that, it's easy to lose your soul. and to lose your moral compass and to forget that these are, we're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with people. We're dealing with, we should let our lives be guided by moral principle and by seeking what's good. And I think that these people have forgotten that. And they have sort of been brainwashed into believing that, in utilitarianism, essentially. And I think it's just heartbreaking. But something that I found so encouraging from the poll, Jeffrey, was this, and that it was the numbers of minorities who questioned the kind of officialdom and who believed in these ethical principles of informed consent. It was higher amongst Blacks and Hispanics than it was amongst whites. And I just felt that is so inspiring and so encouraging, right? That these people, they really truly have their wits about them, and they're not being indoctrinated the same way some people who believe that they're very privileged, they think they're actually being brainwashed, and they've lost their ability to really think critically. And I just thank God for these people who haven't been brainwashed, because they are still really, truly thinking critically, and it's wonderful.
And
this inspires.
Did you notice that there was a greater degree of, I guess you would call it vaccine skepticism, like opposition to mandates in favor of repealing the liability shield, and in favor of more research, more general skepticism in favor of freedom of choice among parents of children who are under the age of 17, right? But the parents are more skeptical than the childless, right?
Yeah. And, there was a poll done a few months ago, maybe, 6 or 8 months ago, that said that 60% of parents have questions about the safety of the childhood vaccination schedule, right? And so I think it's very easy. And the other demographic piece was that in our poll was that those over a certain age were less skeptical, right? So the older ones who don't have children, who are kind of out of that, and who are more likely getting their news from the mainstream outlets, things like this, they are the least skeptical, which kind of makes sense, right? Whereas those who have children and who are actively concerned about the impact of, 70 shots, that's what it was until Secretary Kennedy changed the schedule, or till CDC changed the schedule, they're the ones who are most concerned, and they should be, right? I just think it's easy once the average elderly person doesn't know too. I have people so many times said to me, oh, come on, I got vaccinated when I was young. And I will say to them, what year were you born? How many shots did you get? I was born in 1964. I think you were just a month before me, Jeffrey. And we would have gotten 11 doses of 4 vaccinations in our first year of life. Children today, or children 6 months ago, would get 29, I think it's 28, 29 doses of 11 shots in their first year of life. It might be 14. It's extraordinary, right? And it's nothing compared to what people have had in the past. And so once you point that out, or you say, in our whole lifetime, a child in the 1980s would have gotten 22 doses of 11 vaccinations. A child today, or 6 months ago, would have gotten 72 doses of 16 vaccines. When you put it in that context, then they are taken aback by it, because they just don't know that this schedule has exploded the way it has, and that Congress has indemnified the vaccine makers for it, which is why it's exploded.
Which is a lot of the reason for the proliferation of these shots, right? If you're not responsible for the outcomes, well, who cares, right? We just make money without any kind of responsibility. So the poll shows overwhelming...
And hide the harms too, right? A huge interest in hiding those harms.
That's right. So the poll shows overwhelming public support for the very moderate common sense reforms that are being pushed by the MAHA people and by RFK. But that's not what you're hearing on the streets today, right? I mean, the Fabrizio poll really did disrupt the impression that RFK's agendas popularly You read in the newspapers every day in the mainstream media, RFK is destroying public health and everybody's against him, but this poll shows exactly the opposite.
Yeah, very much so. If you look at the actual question we wrote, it was just, do you support do you agree that the efforts of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, investigate vaccines more thoroughly, and nearly 70% agreed with that. And then if you look at just general for whether or not people support his efforts just to have greater transparency and the overall kind of MAHA agenda to make people healthier, it was I think it was around 70%. I'm trying to find the question right now, but this is extremely popular with the public, and yet there are people who want us to believe that it's not.
And among Republicans, independents, and Democrats. Republicans more than anybody, independents just a little less, and then Democrats a little less than that, right? But it's a broad swath, regardless of party loyalties.
Yeah, 80%. I just found it. 80% support Health and Human Services and the FDA to reduce food dyes and additives. I mean, it goes on and on. 76 support Health and Human Services and EPA to continue phasing out use of pesticides. These are all wildly popular, and yet Congress is trying to pass a liability shield for the pesticide manufacturers. But Jeffrey, something else that I thought was so fantastic. Most Americans probably don't realize that, but back in 1980, there was something called the Bayh-Dole Act, which was passed by Congress, and this allowed taxpayer dollars to be used to fund federal scientists working for all these federal agencies, and then for those scientists to retain the patent rights to anything that they developed on the back of taxpayers. So basically, it allowed them to retain patent rights, and they can earn $150,000 per patent per year. It's staggering. Most Americans don't even know about this. So we asked a very simple question. Do you support legislation prohibiting federal agencies such as FDA, NIH, and CDC and their employees from financially benefiting from taxpayer-funded research? 75%, 76.6% said that they supported this. This bill needs to be repealed, right? This is why Moderna developed, NIAID, Fauci's agency, developed basically the intellectual aspects of the Moderna patent, and then owned 50% of the patent. They transferred the technology to Moderna, and then they benefited from it. And so all these people under Fauci, including Fauci himself, were, raking in $150,000 a year on the back of this, vaccine that they developed, a so-called vaccine that they developed on the back of taxpayer funds. That is so unethical.
And if you own 3, 5, 10 patents, you can become very wealthy as a public servant, working for NIH, whatever. Yeah, unbelievable. But there's so much in this poll. It was actually difficult for us to pick and choose what we wanted to highlight. So I hope that people will go through it and look in detail, and I hope it rocks the public culture to make us realize we've been gaslit, over these subjects for a very long time, partially because of flawed polls, but then a wildly biased mainstream media that's funded in substantial part by the very industries that are benefiting from these mandates, these subsidies, and these indemnifications. So they have an incentive to broadcast an opposite message. And it just falls to Health Freedom Defense Fund and Brownstone Institute and our other partners to, use our very tiny and scarce resources to conduct a poll that makes us realize we're being gaslit. It turns out most people overwhelmingly favor, it's a common sense freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, they would have us all believe that if you believe in freedom, if you believe in transparency, if you want vaccine, in fact, that was 80-some%, I think 85%-ish wanted the data on vaccinations and vaccination studies made public. They wanted full transparency. I mean, it's just, but the media and certain politicians and, certain, folks with the reins of power in their hands, they don't want you to know that. And so to me, the most important thing for people to take away is that you are not alone. You are not fringe. If you believe in common sense, if you believe in the basic right of most of human beings to make their own choices, right? Into self-determination. This is what's so, so important to me. And I think this sort of other lesson in it for me is that I hope that people realize that discernment is something that they and they alone can exercise, and they must do so in any media that they consume. Don't just take the number that you see that, the media is spouting, because it may be manipulated. In fact, it almost certainly is being manipulated if it's in the mainstream media, right? This goes back to the Mockingbird media, where there are intelligence assets installed all across the spectrum of media outlets. And they're doing something there deliberately, which is attempting to manipulate you, propagandize you. And so you have to really be discerning in all of this. And to me, this poll, I think, helps to serve many functions, one of which is to tell the public that they're not alone. Another one is to help them contrast this with other polls so that they can see how easy it is to be manipulated by the way a question is phrased. And then third, for you to understand that it's up to you to engage with those who represent you and ensure that they are doing your bidding, not the bidding of the corporations and those like the pharmaceutical industry, the biggest lobbyists in the world, the largest advertisers in the world, right? It's up to us, Jeffrey, to engage.
Well,
and I think
that really gets us to another little project we've been cooperating on with CHD and many other organizations. You're welcome to mention them. There's many on a petition called covidjustice.org, and it's a very simple petition. It's just asking for an acknowledgement of what happened to us over the last 6 years. Recognize that it was wrong, that it was inconsistent with the Bill of Rights, inconsistent with the Constitution, inconsistent with fundamental human rights, and looking for a clean, clear statement that we as a culture, as a people, need some kind of reckoning, some kind of public statement to this effect. And we're already at 24,000 signatures. It's only been out a few days. And Elon Musk endorsed it, among many other people. And
Dr. Joseph Poe just did as well, Surgeon General of Florida.
Yeah. So, and it's the kind of thing that everybody from all parties should rally around, because the kind of despotism we experienced in that period is not consistent with anybody's views on what constitutes a civilized society, really. And so that covidjustice.org works well in, as a kind of and also another way to message this essential theme with the poll, which is that, despite all the problems that were all around us, most people, if you believe in freedom, most people are with you on that basic principle, that people are not crazy. You're not crazy. And otherwise, we're just being gaslit all the time. That, for me, was a great takeaway. I don't know if you experienced this, but when the results first came in, I looked at them. On one hand, I was shocked. On the other hand, I thought, of course. Of course.
Exactly. Because we're being gaslit too, right? And as much as we try and take a step back and analyze everything that we're seeing around us and try and understand what the hidden agenda might be and all that, it's still hard. It's not easy. I'm not suggesting that it's easy, right? And so, yes, of course, most people actually do have common sense, unless they're part of that laptop class that's been very severely instituted.
Or part of the industry, right? I mean, they're paid to hold the views they do.
That too. So let me just say, can I just say really quickly that the other thing that I'm very excited about is with respect to COVID justice and the Medical Freedom Act Coalition that we've launched, is all of these organizations coming together. So on the COVID justice, we have CHD, HFDF, my group, Brownstone, and we've also got the Independent Medical Alliance, which was formerly FLCC. We've got Autism Action Network, and Stand for Health Freedom. And it is so exciting. I really see this wave of engagement happening, right, from the public, but also from the organizations. We understand that we actually have not only a wave of public support, but we actually have what's morally right. We have the moral authority on our side. And I think that is going to embolden, galvanize us in a way that's never happened before. And so I'm just so inspired by all these people who are coming together, all these organizations. And this poll just reinforces that kind of inspiration that I feel about all this, that we are on the right side of history here. And anybody who's not, look out, because they are not going to be long in their position, whether it's in Congress or state government or whatever. the people are rising and things are going to change. I really fully believe that, and I think that this poll shows that we are moving in the right direction with all of our initiatives. So I'm thrilled to be on the show with you today, Jeffrey, and just to have you as a friend and a collaborator on so many of these initiatives. It's really an honor and a privilege.
It was a delight to work with you, Leslie. You're so intelligent and so discerning on all this stuff. And it was for me, my first rodeo, so to speak. I've never dealt with the polls before, and it was great to have you and your organization as a partner with Brownstone on this great effort. Thank you for being with us today, Leslie.
Thank you.